Agnes, thank you very much for speaking with us. I know that you're doing a lot of work with CARE, especially coming from the perspective of gender regarding community-based adaptation. Can you just explain this intersection and why it's important?
Thanks very much, Adam. It's very nice to be here with you. I can probably start with mentioning what I mentioned at the beginning of the session on gender this week and every other opportunity I've had to speak. Basically, when we think about gender, the first thing that springs to mind instantly is one word, and that's women. And the point that we're very much trying to make here and have been trying to make for a while is that while gender inequalities are very much about women, it's basically about relationships between women and men and between people of different generations and at different stages of their lives, and about the societal norms and expectations that they encounter in that. And that gender equality is not about ensuring that men and women become the same kind of human beings, but actually ensuring that men and women and girls and boys have the same life chances, opportunities and choices throughout their life. And that has a lot to do with adaptation to climate change as well, because it's about finding the right strategies to adapt to current and future impacts of climate change, but also about evaluating and the impact of climate change on people in a given community. And they very much depend on kind of the social tissue and socioeconomic differences between people at the community level. And we know from our experiences across development, not just in climate change, that people in a given community, their choices, their opportunities, their access to resources, access to information, their influence on decision making, may that be public or at the household level, very much depends on whether they're male or female, and what stage of their life they're at the moment, whether they're a young girl or an adolescent woman or a divorced woman or a married husband. The roles very much depend on that. This is what we're trying to raise awareness on, but also to integrate in our programming on community-based adaptation.
And is it particularly relevant in community-based adaptation? Because we're hearing a lot of people talk about using traditional knowledge and traditional kind of cultural means of communicating, but actually sometimes maybe this play into quite gendered or politicized or ethnic strands within a community. Like, are there specific dangers here beyond other programs, or is it the similar kind of work to your other mainstream projects?
I think there are two things here. One is the matter of impact and scale, and a very scary number that we have is that we can see that in a few natural disasters that we've looked at in more detail, the mortality gap between men and women during and after those disasters was up to 90%. And at a broader scale, there's a study of 141 countries done by LSE a few years ago, where they looked at natural disaster impacts across the scale, across the board, and looked at why there were such huge mortality gaps between women and men and why women were dying in larger numbers at an earlier age than men. And they found that it was not because women are physically weaker or biologically less adept to running away or to protecting themselves in a disaster, but it was actually very much down to that country's performance in terms of social and economic rights for women and men. So they made a really strong case for disasters being a particularly cruel example of gender gaps worldwide. But I think another thing about climate change is not just about disasters. It's also about processes across a longer spectrum of time. And what we see in a few countries I've worked with, for example, in Africa and in West Africa, is that negotiating transformation is also a matter of negotiation between generations. And if you speak to elders, if you speak to younger people, and if you speak to kind of 20, 30, 40-year-old people in developing countries, they will have different visions and different aspirations for the future. And that is there's also a power relationship there, and that is also really important to take those different views into account. And I think it's especially important to take young people's views and aspirations for the future into account, but also rely on elder people to tell us what was going on in the past, because they can actually observe the pace at which these changes are happening now. They can say, well, changes have always happened, but right now they're happening at a very short period of time, and at a very large scale and high intensity.
So what's the response to this? You know, what are the methods and approaches and techniques that can be used to limit these problems?
It starts with awareness. It definitely starts with speaking to people. I'm talking about multiple levels here, not just the community level, but also the global policy level or this conference. in raising awareness that in trying to bring gender into community-based adaptation, it's not yet another kind of bringing our agenda on board. But it's really also about being more aware of something that really matters for community-based adaptation, being more aware of something that will improve our performance in our community-based interventions, and that will also improve the overall development goal of reaching gender equality, which we still haven't been very good at overall in the developing world. And as soon as people start seeing how small steps in reducing gender inequalities can actually change a lot at a larger scale, we get more and more people on board. At a more practical level, it burns down to, I'd say, tools. Tools are really important. A lot of the tools that we've been using in community-based adaptation, whether they are about communication or about monitoring and evaluation, or about vulnerability assessments at the beginning of a project, a lot of them are really what we call gender blind. They don't really make a difference between people at the community level. And we're trying to improve that. We're trying to integrate that as a starting point. And then we have to go up to higher levels and look at policies at the regional, at the national level, at the global level, and make sure that an understanding of gender differentiated impacts of climate change, but also of the need to include everybody in the response to it, is still missing and needs to be better included.
And how receptive are people to this message, and how well are we doing at rising to the challenge?
That's a tricky one. This is a question I've been thinking about over the last few days, because this conference is about communicating community-based adaptation, and as somebody in my organization and in the kind of the broader climate change and development community who tries to communicate the importance of gender issues to others, I know it's not very easy. Gender is actually a very personal issue. All of us have a gendered role, and all of us deal with problems and hopes and aspirations around that, and it's a very personal question. It's also a question of power relationships between people and resistance to changes in power relationships. And as such, it's really hard to talk about gender in an area where we're trying to be really practical and really policy and solution oriented. We don't have much time to solve the issues that we're dealing with in climate change. And negotiating changes in gender relationships take a long time. And I think that's the real challenge we're facing in communicating it.
And just finally then, what are going to be your takeaways from this conference? What did you enjoy most, find most interesting, most challenging? What are you going to take back and be able to apply to your work?
I really enjoyed the sessions where we had a chance to step out of our classic sitting on a panel and presenting our work to others formats, and sit down together and get our heads around the question, wrap our heads around a difficult question, because it's really empowering to see the energy that gets created by putting a few people from different kinds of organizations together in a room and have them sort out something. You don't have to actually tell them how they have to do it or what they have to come up with. They will come up with something. It always happens. And I find it really empowering. So I'm really hoping that what I would like to take back to my work is really dealing with how do we really learn? What really causes change in our practice? What really has an impact on us as individuals? And I'm hoping that we find a little bit more of a creative solution to that, because we do reiterate quite a lot of what we say all the time, and it's fun to speak to each other in a more informal way. Yeah.
Agnes, thank you very much for speaking with us.